Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. The topics discussed in this podcast will reflect my opinions and are not in any way to be regarded as medical advice. There's a very old joke. What's the difference between God and a doctor? God doesn't think he's a doctor. Times do change. That idea could probably be more aptly applied these days to certain politicians, and certainly not to doctors in general, but it could be applied to some people in academia and big public health. I was asked recently a very interesting question, which got me thinking, and hence what we'll chat about in this podcast, because I always work on the basis if somebody asks a question, usually it's indicative that other people are thinking it as well. In fact, many years ago, I'm going to digress for a moment, many years ago a doctor associate of mine who went into politics said, as a member of parliament, if three constituents went to his office or raised an issue with his office about the same matter, they regarded that as a really important issue. 3 people, and electorates can have 100,000 voters, but if 3 went to the trouble of contacting an office, it meant it was important. A little bit of a diversion, but it does tell you a little bit about perhaps human beings' reluctance to pop their heads above the radar or to ask questions. But the question was asked to me is, when did doctors stop being comforting and reassuring? And it was a really interesting question. And in the first half of 2025, depending when you're listening to this, there have been in different parts of the world, and that includes parts of Europe, parts of Australia, parts of the US, and I suspect other places as well, it might not make the news, there have been some cases of measles. Now, measles is not a particularly pleasant illness. Don't get me wrong, it's not pleasant. But it used to be quite endemic. Vaccination against measles came in during the 1960s, and in many parts of the world we've seen a substantial drop in the number of cases. And that's obviously a good thing. But it also means that we just don't see cases anymore, which again is an obvious correlation with that. And we tend to forget that notwithstanding it can be a very nasty illness and in rare instances fatal, and that's more from the complications like encephalitis, which is an inflammation of the brain, which is a very, very serious condition, or pneumonia, which can also be very serious, especially in a younger age group, that a lot of people who got measles got better. Similar with other childhood illnesses, that includes chickenpox and mumps. People got it, they got better. Obviously, not everybody did, and the idea of vaccinating means there are less cases, and if people do get it, it's less serious, and the number of deaths goes down. But what goes out of living memory is that for the vast majority of people, even if they do get one of these illnesses, they will recover from it. And so now we get these scare tactics. And I was asked 2 questions by 2 different people. One, the first one I mentioned, when did doctors stop being, if you like, comforting and reassuring? And the other is, hang on, I remember, and this is obviously a person who is old enough to remember, when measles was just part of the landscape and we didn't get that excited about it. And now we do get this view promulgated that any infectious disease is going to be the end of the world, and we'll touch later a little bit on perhaps the origins of that, and I suspect you all know where I'm going with that one. And it is unfortunately largely driven by doctors, but in particular, driven by doctors in big public health. This includes people like chief health officers and also those in various authoritative positions. Now, for example, in a practice of medicine, from time to time, unfortunately, but it's life, it's inevitable, you do need to give people bad news. We've done some tests. It's come back that you've got, for example, type 2 diabetes. You might have some form of cancer. And a lot of cancers, and obviously type 2 diabetes, there's ways of managing and treating that. Different types of cancers, there may be some ways forward. Others, the outlook is necessarily not very good. But the response with the diagnosis is not, oh, this is terrible, oh, you're going to die, like, the sky is falling stuff. It's, look, this is, a matter of fact, this is the diagnosis, this is what we're going to need to do about it. Now, what we do about it might include treatment. It might include making you more comfortable. And in fact, a quote attributed to Edward Livingston Trudeau, who, and I was not familiar with this gentleman, I've heard the quote, who apparently was the founder of a TB sanatorium at Saranac Lake. I don't know if I've got that pronunciation correct. Which is the role of the doctor is to cure sometimes, to relieve often, to comfort always. So even in the face of a bad diagnosis, one can provide some comfort. Now that's not a there, it's all going to go away like you might tell a child who stubbed their toes. If there's a diagnosis of cancer, it's not probably going to go away. There might be some treatment and people can go into remission, but the outlook may not be that good. And in my experience, and this is the experience of most doctors, indeed most people, it's worse not knowing than knowing. Once you know what's going on, you can deal with it. If you have to get your affairs in order, then you can look to get your affairs in order. It's better than not knowing. And the people around you can start to get themselves a little bit prepared for the the inevitable if that's coming. And then if you do better than expected, that's a bonus. But it's very, very much what can we do to make the situation as good as it can be, not taking away from the severity of the situation. Now, with infectious diseases, where the survival rate is extremely high, this arcing up as if it's going to be the end of the world is essentially a form of fear porn. And the question really did arise, and was put to me, when did this happen? And there's a sub-question underneath that which could be, well, why did it happen? And when did it happen? Look, I think we all know this. It happened during the pandemic response, when essentially what was a cold, and this became very, very evident by a few months in, was turned into this fearsome killer that was going to get everybody. And of course, we were never all in it together. There were certain groups that were more vulnerable. That was apparent from March 2020. But the powers that be, and in particular I point the finger at doctors in authority, government employee doctors, not those who are dealing with patients day to day, just cranked up the fear. And then medical organisations got on board and also cranked up the fear, and the politicians loved it because, to get back to where we start, the politicians like to think they're playing God and therefore they're protecting their flock from the ravages of a virus. So there are some interesting parallels between the roles of high priests back in maybe the 1400s and politicians who now regard themselves as the high priests in the 21st century. And not everybody believes in a higher power, and I'm not talking about religion in this, but it's estimated that 80-90% of the world's population do have some belief that there is something bigger than ourselves. And when you just look up the sky at night time, I think there's a very strong case for thinking there's more out there than just this planet, and it probably doesn't all happen quite by chance. Can we explain it? No. Are we supposed to? Absolutely not. But everybody's entitled to their opinion on that. So essentially, I think in terms of the question, when did it happen? Certainly happened during the pandemic response. In terms of why did it happen, I think there is a little bit of a reversion to some of these government employee doctors and others in the bureaucratic positions sort of believing that they're God and that what they do can somehow counteract the effects of nature, and that somehow they're better than everybody else. And you know what? They're not. The other why in this is that if you're a government bureaucrat doctor, you don't actually see patients. Nobody comes in to talk to you, sit down face to face, explains what their symptoms are. You are there to make some sort of diagnosis, explain what's going on, explain to that individual person not only the proposed treatment, but also, and this is apart from an ethical, it's a legal requirement, the downsides. What are the side effects of treatment? What are the potential complications of an operation, for example? And that all needs to be explained. And by the way, whether or not it goes according to plan or it doesn't, you're going to see that person again. If you're sitting in an office somewhere on the 24th floor of some building in the middle of a CBD, that doesn't apply to you. So you don't see the consequences of the recommendations that you make. And that removes you from the real world. And that, I suspect, is part of the other why. And maybe there is also this godlike view, similar to the pandemic response, that if I make decisions and make recommendations, that somehow I can stand between the populace and nature, and it's never going to happen. So to get back to where we started, viruses have been around probably for as long as and probably before human beings. Bacteria go way back before human beings, and they are never going to be eliminated. They can be reduced. We have ways of treating certain things in medicine. We can do more today than we did 100 years ago, and in 100 years' time we'll be able to do more again. That's good. I'm not totally convinced we're ever going to reach a stage where nobody ever gets sick from anything at any time. Who knows what happens in 1,000 years? But I think in any sort of foreseeable or even medium-term future, and by that I'm talking 100 years or so, it isn't going to happen. So we can minimise, but we can't eliminate. And when people do get sick, an important role of the medical profession, and I'd maybe broaden that out, and that includes nurses who typically do this better than doctors and others, is to be honest and, in the words of Edward Livingston Trudeau, to comfort always. And again, and I'm repeating myself, but I think it's important. That's not a there, don't worry about it. It's a what can we do to make you as best as possible in the totality of your circumstances, not diminishing the circumstances, not saying they're not there, and not necessarily saying it's all going to go away. But what can we do so that whilst you're in this situation, and for as long as you're in this situation, we can make it as best we can without upping the ante and without striking terror and fear into people? I think at some point we need to very, very strongly get back to that approach. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and consider subscribing. Tell your friends. If there are topics you'd like to see covered, be in touch through the chat or email info@drjoe.net.au. We'll be uploading new content each Monday, and soon we'll be putting these videos out on X. You can follow me there at Dr. Joe's DIY Health.